December 24th, 1944. Wyoming lay buried under 3 feet of snow. Behind the barbed wire, thin German prisoners stood in line, breath turning to mist in the freezing air. They expected a bowl of thin soup, maybe a crust of bread. Then, metal doors swung open, light spilled out, and on the tables waited roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, warm pie, and coffee. The guards, American soldiers who once fought these men in Europe, were now serving them dinner. That night, war changed its face. No gunfire, no interrogation, only abundance. Cold, quiet, deliberate. A nation powerful enough to feed those who had tried to destroy it. For many German prisoners, that first bite of American turkey was the moment their world cracked. When they realized the most dangerous weapon of all wasn't artillery, but a system that could turn wheat, machines, and compassion into victory. Tonight, we follow those trays of food through the frozen corridors of America's POW camps, to uncover how a meal of kindness shattered pride, planted the seeds of reconstruction, and ended a war inside men's minds long before the shooting stopped. May 1943. Tunisia fell silent. Across the desert, hundreds of thousands of German and Italian troops laid down their arms. The Afrika Korps, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had vanished in a single week. Under the blazing sun, long columns of prisoners stretched across the sand. Men who once believed in a 1,000-year Reich, now prisoners of a nation they barely understood. They thought they were bound for prison, for punishment, perhaps Siberia, perhaps starvation. Instead, they were heading to a continent they had only known through propaganda. Not the land of mongrels and chaos, as the Nazi leaflets claimed, but a country of cornfields, electric light, and machines that never slept. The journey to America began aboard Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic in convoys guarded by destroyers. On deck, the captured Germans watched sailors laugh, drink coffee, and throw away food that could have fed a village. They threw whole loaves of bread into the trash, one prisoner wrote. We fought each other for the scraps, and the sailors only laughed. For the first time, these men saw abundance used carelessly, and they began to suspect that perhaps they had never known what power truly was. By winter 1944, more than 425,000 German prisoners were scattered across 700 camps in 46 states. From Texas to Colorado, from Wisconsin to Georgia, each facility mirrored the same design. Barracks, water heaters, mess halls, medical tents, libraries, even theaters. The War Department followed the Geneva Convention to the letter and then exceeded it. An officer wrote in his log, "If we want them to understand why they lost, we must let them live inside the system that defeated them." Captivity in America became an experiment in silent persuasion. No slogans, no lectures, just food, order, and light that never went out. When the train stopped at Camp Hearne, Texas, the air smelled of pine and gasoline. The new arrivals expected dogs, guns, beatings. Instead, they were led through hot showers, given clean uniforms, leather boots, and wool blankets. Breakfast the next day, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, orange juice, coffee. Lunch, pork roast, mashed potatoes, apple pie. Rudolf Krauss, a former artillery corporal, wrote in disbelief, "We thought it was a trick. We hid bread under our pillows, but the next day and the next, the same food appeared again." The shock wasn't just physical, it was moral. They had been told America was decadent, weak, collapsing. Yet here, even in wartime, prisoners ate better than German soldiers at the front. Life in the camps ran with mechanical precision. American guards watched from towers, but inside the fences, German sergeants still held roll call, organized work details, and maintained discipline. The Wehrmacht's hierarchy persisted, now powered by American electricity. At Camp Greeley, Colorado, the commander, Colonel James Morrison, addressed the new arrivals. "You remain soldiers. You will organize yourselves. We will provide security and see the rules kept. How you live inside these fences is up to you." The result surprised everyone. Classes began spontaneously: mathematics, engineering, English. Professors captured in Normandy taught lectures on physics. Camp libraries filled with books once banned in Germany, Shakespeare, Thomas Mann, even American newspapers. A prisoner wrote, "We opened pages our homeland had burned." By autumn 1944, America faced a labor shortage. Millions of farmhands had gone to war. German prisoners became the replacement workforce. They harvested sugar beets in Nebraska, stacked hay in Wyoming, picked peaches in Georgia. Each man earned 80 cents a day, part cash, part credit toward repatriation. They worked alongside American civilians, many of them women, teenagers, and elderly farmers. Otto Brenner, a former Panzer driver, learned to operate a John Deere tractor. "One farmer with one machine could do what our whole village needed a week to finish," he wrote. Their machines never tired, their fields never ended. For the prisoners, these farms became open-air classrooms. They saw a society that conquered through productivity, not conquest. A power rooted in creation, not destruction. November 25, 1943. Across America, kitchens filled with the scent of turkey and butter. At Camp Hearne, 1,800 German prisoners sat before plates piled higher than anything they had seen in years. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. For a moment, no one moved. Then a guard said softly, "Happy Thanksgiving." The men stared. They didn't even know what the word meant, but they understood abundance when they saw it. Private Kurt Zimmerman wrote home 6 months later, "They celebrate a feast while at war and feed their enemies like nobility. If every American family eats as we did that day, then America's not a country, it is a miracle." That evening, hundreds of prisoners attended a voluntary chapel service, not for faith, but to understand how mercy could exist in war. The POW system became a mirror of American society itself. Rules existed, but punishment was rare. Escape attempts were almost non-existent. Fewer than 1% ever fled, and most returned voluntarily, cold, hungry, ashamed. The absence of brutality was disarming. It forced reflection. Many began to wonder whether fear had ever been necessary at all. Captain Friedrich Weber wrote, "At home we were told discipline required cruelty. Here order grows from fairness. They prove that obedience can come from respect." Within months, the camps became laboratories of the mind. The Special Projects Division of the War Department called it re-education. Its purpose was simple: expose the German soldier to freedom without forcing it upon him. Films, newspapers, lectures, and debates spread through the compounds. One camp newspaper published essays on democracy, human rights, and philosophy. Another ran translations of the U.S. Constitution. The guards didn't preach. They simply handed out typewriters, ink, and paper. The prisoners did the rest. Outside the fences, American life glowed with energy. Trains ran on schedule. Cafes stayed open at midnight. Radio shows played swing music from coast to coast. Inside, the prisoners listened and compared it with reports from home. Bombings, rationing, collapse. Each broadcast eroded the myth of the superior race. Wilhelm Hoffmann noted, "We fought for a Germany that promised greatness, But here, I see greatness without cruelty. They have conquered us not with fear, but with food. By the winter of 1944, the psychological war was over. Most prisoners no longer dreamed of Nazi victory. They dreamed of survival and of understanding how a democracy could feed, clothe, and heal even its enemies. They began to plan for life after the war. They studied American farming methods, industrial organization, and civic structure. They wrote journals, drew diagrams, memorized mechanical designs. When freedom eventually came, they would take those lessons home. And perhaps that was America's quietest triumph of all. A campaign fought not with bombs or bullets, but with decency, abundance, and the irresistible logic of everyday kindness. In the vast geography of World War II, there were many battlefields, but one of the most decisive was fenced by wire, lit by electric bulbs and perfumed with the smell of roasted turkey. Here the idea of democracy proved itself, not through speeches, but through sustenance. A hot meal, a clean bed, and a sense of dignity became instruments of conversion. When the war finally ended, these men would carry home more than memories. They would carry the blueprint of a new Germany, one built not on domination, but on the quiet strength of plenty. November 1943. Across Europe, cities still burned and artillery thundered. But in the far fields of Texas, war sounded different. The scrape of shovels in frozen soil, the hiss of coffee poured into tin cups, and the steady breathing of 1,800 German prisoners waiting for supper. That night inside Camp Hearne, the mess hall doors opened to a light so bright it stung their eyes. They expected the usual ration: bread, thin soup, maybe a potato. Instead, they found Thanksgiving dinner: roasted turkey, buttered vegetables, pies that steamed in the winter air. For a moment, no one moved. Then a guard smiled. "Eat," he said quietly. "It's Thanksgiving." They didn't understand the word, but they understood the meaning of mercy. The sound of forks against metal trays echoed through the hall, and with it began the slow collapse of certainty. Over the following weeks, rumors spread through the camps. America was feeding its enemies better than Germany fed its allies. It wasn't propaganda. It was logistics. Each POW received 3,200 calories a day. Meat, bread, milk, vegetables, delivered by a supply system so vast that even the guards sometimes marveled at it. A corporal noted in his diary, "They have built a machine that runs on food, fuel, and faith. We tried to build one on fear. It is clear whose will lasts longer." Abundance itself became a language. Every meal was a lesson in what an open economy could produce, what democracy could sustain. None of this happened by accident. In 1943, the War Department established the Special Project Division, a group of academics, linguists, and psychologists who believed that ideas could be fed, not forced. Their plan exposed German soldiers to a working democracy, not through speeches, but through experience. Clean water, electric lights, freedom of worship, a newspaper that didn't lie. Inside the camps, they created miniature cities, workshops, classrooms, orchestras, libraries. Prisoners taught mathematics, engineering, and philosophy to one another. They debated politics under watchtowers lit by American bulbs. "They don't tell us what to think," one prisoner wrote. "They let us live in a place where thinking is allowed." By late 1944, labor shortages pulled thousands of prisoners beyond the fences. Under armed supervision, they worked America's harvest. In Colorado, they cut sugar beets beneath a sky so wide it made them dizzy. In Nebraska, they repaired fences, built barns, drove tractors they had never seen before. One farmer said, "They came as enemies. They left as field hands and friends. The pay was modest, 80 cents a day. But the true wage was revelation. They saw the core of American strength, machines that multiplied effort, trust that multiplied men." Otto Weber, once a panzer mechanic, wrote home, "Here one man with a machine does the work of 20. This is how they win wars, by refusing to waste energy on hate." December 1944. Snow swept across Wyoming and the Dakotas. The war in Europe raged toward its final fury. But inside the camps, Christmas came quietly. The YMCA sent instruments, violins, accordions, drums. Prisoners built a stage, decorated pine branches, and rehearsed carols. That Christmas Eve, they sang Stille Nacht, while American guards listened from the doorway. When the final note faded, no one clapped. No one spoke. The silence felt holy. A lieutenant recorded in his journal, "We have been fighting ghosts. Tonight they looked human again." For the Germans, it was worse than defeat. It was absolution they didn't know how to bear. Within months, doctors noticed a paradox. The prisoners were gaining weight, 20, 30 pounds. But many showed signs of depression. Some wept at meals, others refused food. Army psychologists called it prosperity trauma, the guilt of living well while families starved. At Camp Florence, Arizona, a medic wrote, "These men fear kindness more than punishment. Hunger they can understand. Mercy confuses them. To survive luxury after years of deprivation felt like betrayal. Every bite of turkey, every cup of milk reminded them that their world of order and sacrifice had been built on lies." In the spring of 1945, re-education deepened. Films like Why We Fight played in the mess halls. Camps printed German-language newspapers filled with essays on freedom and law. Some prisoners scoffed, others listened, and a few began to change. Captain Friedrich Weber wrote, "If freedom can feed its enemies, perhaps it can feed our children too." Without sermons, democracy was teaching itself. As the Reich crumbled, letters from home arrived through the Red Cross. Stories of hunger, bombings, and fear. Inside the camps, the lights stayed on, the meals stayed warm. Private Hans Riedel confessed, "I feel shame when I wash my hands in hot water. In Hamburg, my mother melts snow for tea." The myth of German greatness dissolved not in battle, but in bathrooms and dining halls. It ended with soap, electricity, and mercy. For the guards, the experience was no less strange. Many were small-town boys from Iowa or Georgia. They had been told these men were monsters, but in time they saw only tired faces and the same longing for home. Sergeant Tom Riley wrote to his wife, "I look at them and think, if our boys were captured, I'd want them treated the same." That realization spread quietly across the country. America's greatness wasn't measured by victory, but by how it handled the vanquished. By Christmas 1944, the transformation was complete. Nazi flags had disappeared from the barracks. Prisoners formed orchestras, study groups, and self-governing councils. Some even volunteered for civic lectures on democracy. The Battle of the Bulge still raged in Europe, but here, inside barbed wire and snow, another kind of battle had already been won. They no longer believed in conquest. They believed in possibility. For the first time, German soldiers began to imagine a future without tyranny. A world rebuilt from the lessons of their own captivity. When historians later searched for the moment Nazi ideology truly began to die, they found it not in Berlin nor on Omaha Beach, but in the mess halls of America's heartland. In the steam of mashed potatoes, the hum of generators, and the quiet discipline of decency. The prisoners had entered those camps as soldiers of a brutal empire. They left as witnesses to democracy's strength. No banners, no speeches, only the unanswerable truth. That kindness, when organized, is unstoppable. Spring 1945. The war outside raged to its final act. Berlin burning, armies collapsing, civilians starving. But inside the wire of America's prison camps, there was silence. No air raids, no hunger, no fear. Only the quiet rhythm of full stomachs and troubled sleep. It should have been peace. Instead, it became something else. A confrontation not with enemies, but with themselves. Sergeant Wilhelm Schaefer of the 21st Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "We have food, beds, music, books, everything a man could want. And yet I lie awake every night. I don't understand why kindness feels like punishment. The barbed wire no longer imprisoned their bodies. It imprisoned their thoughts." By mid-1945, reports from Germany reached the camps. Cities flattened, children starving, families displaced. Each letter home was an open wound. Mother writes that they eat turnip soup every day. Father says he burns furniture to keep warm. And yet in America, the POWs sat before steaming meals. Meat, bread, milk. They ate in silence, each bite a reminder of someone else's hunger. Medical officers noticed the change. Men grew restless, irritable, withdrawn. The psychologists called it the prosperity paradox. At Camp Crossville, Tennessee, Lieutenant Harold Morrison observed, "They begin to feel guilty for surviving too well. They dream of home and wake up ashamed for being fed." For some, that guilt became unbearable. 2 prisoners refused to eat for days. Others volunteered for extra labor as if work could repay an invisible debt. The first cracks in ideology came quietly. In reading rooms and classrooms, officers who once shouted about victory now read American novels in the afternoon sun. The symbols of the Reich faded from memory, replaced by words. Responsibility, democracy, human rights. One morning, guards found a Nazi flag torn into pieces, used to clean a barracks window. No one claimed it. No one punished it. Inside the same camp, an orchestra formed from former regimental bands. They practiced Beethoven and Bach, but one evening they played the Star-Spangled Banner. Not mockingly, but with solemn respect. A guard remembered it wasn't surrender, it was confession. To live well under defeat was a kind of torment. The prisoners struggled to understand the logic of their captors. Why feed the enemy? Why treat them with dignity when their own regime had shown none? At Camp Florence, Arizona, a physician, Dr. Robert Muller, noticed men trembling when given fruit or chocolate. He wrote, "They fear kindness. It threatens everything they were taught about strength. For years they had been told mercy was weakness, that compassion was sentimental decay. Now faced with both in abundance, their faith in their own superiority collapsed. They conquer by feeding us," one officer said bitterly. "This is not war. It is humiliation through generosity." Every 2 weeks, Red Cross couriers carried censored letters between camps in Europe. But many never reached home. They were too honest. In one confiscated letter, Friedrich Wagner confessed, "My dear Greta, I cannot tell you the truth. I eat meat every day while you starve. The Americans treat us better than our own government ever did. I am ashamed to be healthy." Censors removed such words, fearing they would break German civilian morale. Still, rumors spread. Families began to whisper that their captured sons lived like kings in America. The shame crossed oceans. Not every prisoner accepted the new reality. Hardline Nazi officers called the others traitors. They formed underground cells, held secret meetings, and tried to enforce discipline through threats and intimidation. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, propaganda officers circulated pamphlets praising Hitler, warning that Germany would rise again. They painted swastikas on walls, sang old marches at night, but the majority turned away. Some refused to salute. Others tore up the pamphlets. One evening, a sergeant named Karl Roth confronted the radicals and said, "If your Führer were alive, he would have left you here to die. I'm done serving ghosts." That was the moment the Reich truly ended. Not in Berlin, but in an Oklahoma barracks lit by a single bare bulb. With the ideology fading, the prisoners were left with emptiness. They no longer believed in victory, but they didn't yet know what to believe in. Some turned to religion, attending chapel services held by American chaplains. Others sought comfort in work or study, but many faced what psychologists called existential collapse. Captain Gerhard Hennes, once a decorated officer, wrote, "We are the walking dead, fed, clothed, and meaningless." The comfort that surrounded them only deepened their despair. They saw the scale of what they had destroyed and what their enemies had built. "We bombed civilization," one said quietly. "They built it back every morning." In March 1945, Camp Hearne's administration introduced a voluntary education corps. Classes in civics, economics, and ethics filled the schedule. Attendance was optional, but the rooms were full. Men who once memorized military codes now studied constitutions. A professor captured in Normandy gave lectures titled "The Anatomy of Freedom." When asked why he bothered, he said, "Because we must learn to deserve the mercy we were shown." It was the closest thing to repentance the war would ever produce. By summer 1945, news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached every camp. There were no cheers, no tears, just silence. A guard described it as the sound of 400,000 men exhaling at once. Then came the new hunger, not for food, but for purpose. The prisoners asked for newspapers, maps, information. What would become of their homes? Would they be sent to France for labor? To Britain for rebuilding? Or would they ever see Germany again? Uncertainty replaced war, and for soldiers raised to obey, nothing was more terrifying than choice. In the final months before repatriation, the War Department initiated interviews. They asked each prisoner, "What have you learned?" Some answered mechanically, others hesitated. A few broke down entirely. Lieutenant Miller said, "I have learned that the enemy who feeds you becomes your teacher. That victory built on cruelty is defeat, and that mercy is not weakness, it is power without fear." His statement was copied and sent to Washington. It became part of an internal report titled "Behavioral Shifts in German Prisoners of War." The report concluded, "Exposure to democratic abundance yields permanent ideological change." In other words, the experiment had worked. Yet for many, the transformation was incomplete. At night, they dreamed of firebombed cities, of the children they could not save, of wives standing in rubble. They woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, the taste of safety that felt like betrayal. Captain Weber wrote in 1946, "We will go home fatter, but emptier." When liberation finally came, they did not celebrate, they feared it. Because freedom now meant returning to hunger and to the ghosts of those who had not been fed. By the end of 1945, the war outside was over. But inside these men, a quieter war continued. A war between what they had believed and what they had seen. Mercy had been their battlefield, and no one who lived through it came out unscathed. When one American officer asked a departing prisoner what he would remember most, the man paused and said, "The taste of warm bread." and the shame that came with it. That was the true hell within. Not starvation, not cruelty, but the unbearable realization that kindness could wound deeper than hate. May 1945. The Reich was gone. In Germany, cities lay in ruins. In America, the lights still burned bright over the camps. For 425,000 German prisoners, the war had ended long before the surrender. They had lived its aftermath in advance, eating 3 meals a day while their families starved across an ocean. Now victory carried no joy, only uncertainty. The guards congratulated them politely, but no one celebrated. The prisoners stood in the parade grounds, watching the American flag ripple in the wind, and realized the most terrifying thing imaginable. They were free soon, and they were not ready. In the summer of 1945, the War Department introduced something new. The repatriation diet, a slow, deliberate reduction of food. Meat disappeared first, then butter, then sugar. Bread grew thinner, coffee weaker. At first the men protested, then they understood. A camp doctor explained, if they return to Germany eating as they do now, their bodies will fail. We must teach them to starve again. The prisoners complied in silence. It was the cruelest kindness yet, a farewell measured in hunger. February 1946, Camp Hearne, Texas. The war had been over for months, but the camp kitchen burned brighter than ever. It was the final meal before repatriation. A farewell dinner served to the men who had lived there for 3 years. On the tables, shrimp cocktail, prime rib, lobster tail, baked potatoes with butter, asparagus, wine, and cake. The guards ate beside the prisoners. No speeches, no orders, only the sound of forks, the murmur of gratitude, and tears that no one tried to hide. One man wrote later, "It was too much. We could have faced hatred, even cruelty, but kindness. Kindness breaks a man in places no bullet can reach." When the lights dimmed, an American sergeant stood and raised his glass. "To peace," he said simply. And for the first time in years, everyone believed the word. The voyage back to Europe began under gray skies. Ships once used for invasion now carried prisoners home. Many had arrived on the Queen Mary as captives. Now they boarded again. Fat, healthy, almost unrecognizable. They stared at the coastline of America fading into fog. Some wept openly, others turned away. Sergeant Hans Weber wrote in his diary, "They gave us everything, and in doing so, they took away the lies we live by." For weeks, the ships sailed east toward a continent they no longer trusted. On board, American medics monitored their health. Doctors recorded their weight, knowing what would happen once they returned to a starving nation. "We send them home well-fed," one officer wrote, "but I fear the world waiting for them will starve the hope we built." June 1946, Bremen. The docks were unrecognizable. A landscape of shattered cranes, twisted rails, and civilians with hollow eyes waiting for loved ones who no longer existed. The German prisoners stepped onto the platform, carrying suitcases filled with American-made soap, cigarettes, and photos from a world that no longer fit them. Their families could hardly recognize them. "You look like an American," one woman whispered to her husband. He smiled weakly. He didn't feel like either. Within weeks, they began to lose the American weight. 30, 40 pounds gone in months. They shared their food rations with children, burned with guilt for every meal they had eaten behind barbed wire in comfort. Lieutenant Heinrich Wagner wrote, "Better to have known hunger all along than to taste fullness once and lose it." In the ruins of post-war Germany, mercy itself became a haunting memory. The prisoners who had lived well in captivity found themselves distrusted by neighbors who had suffered. Some were called traitors, men who had surrendered their pride in exchange for comfort. Others hid their experiences entirely, pretending they had been mistreated like everyone else. But at night the dreams returned. Dreams of electric lights humming above wooden tables, of hot meals and American laughter. They woke sweating, feeling the strange ache of nostalgia for their own captivity. Captain Weber wrote, "The worst punishment is to remember kindness, when the world around you has forgotten it." Yet the story did not end with guilt. Among the returning prisoners were engineers, farmers, teachers, men who had seen how democracy fed its people, and they carried that knowledge like contraband. Hans Müller, once a panzer mechanic, began rebuilding farm cooperatives in Bavaria. He introduced tractors modeled after the John Deeres he had used in Colorado. Production rose by 40%. Friedrich Schmidt, a former logistics officer, helped design food distribution systems under the American occupation. He borrowed ideas from U.S. camp management: rations by weight, not rank; organization by efficiency, not ideology. They became the invisible architects of Germany's recovery. A quiet generation shaped not by war, but by the discipline of abundance. In Washington, the War Department published its final assessment in 1955. Prisoners held in the United States demonstrate democratic tendencies 3 times higher than those held by other Allied powers. The conclusion was stark. America had won a second war, a moral one fought not with bombs or bullets, but with the power of decency. The strategy had no name, no medals. It was simply this: treat men as they might become, not as what they were. And in doing so, America had reprogrammed the defeated army of a fallen empire into the foundation of a new democracy. 20 years later, in 1963, the small Texas town of Hearne held a memorial. The camp was gone, its fences dismantled, its barracks rotted away. But that night, former prisoners returned. Now gray-haired businessmen, engineers, professors. They brought photographs, diaries, and the strange warmth that lingers between former enemies. One of them spoke quietly to the crowd. "Here we lost a war, but here we learned how to become human again." The locals didn't applaud. They simply stood in silence. For both sides knew that some victories are too profound for celebration. Today the fields of Camp Hearne are empty. Grass grows where watchtowers once stood. But if you walk there at dusk, the air still carries something unseen. The echo of languages once divided by hate, and the soft murmur of men who discovered redemption in captivity. Historians call it America's quiet victory. But for the men who lived it, it was something simpler: the realization that civilization itself is a choice, one proven not in triumph, but in how it treats the defeated. The war's end was not written in treaties or parades. It was written in kitchens, in the warmth of a meal shared between enemies. The soldiers who once believed in domination returned home carrying a new kind of strength, the strength to rebuild, to forgive, to live. One of them, years later, said to his son, "I learned the truth of freedom not when I was free, but when I was fed by those I was taught to hate." That is the legacy of America's POW camps. Not humiliation, but healing. Not propaganda, but proof that mercy, when organized, can reshape nations. The final American camp closed in 1946. The lights went out, the gates unlocked. But somewhere in the stillness, a truth remained. Wars end when one side wins. Peace begins when the other side understands why. And in those snowy mess halls of 1944, between laughter, fear, and the scent of roasted turkey, that understanding was born.